I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
The Windsor banquet was already underway when King Charles suddenly stopped everything. Conversations died. Glasses remained suspended above the table. Then his eyes fixed on one small detail pinned to Queen Camilla's dress, a rare brooch once closely associated with Diana. Charles did not look confused. He looked shaken. And when he quietly ordered the banquet halted, everyone in the room understood that this was no ordinary piece of jewelry and no ordinary royal disagreement. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles lowered his glass without speaking. Around him, the carefully arranged Windsor Castle banquet, an intimate royal dinner held inside one of the monarchy's oldest residences, suddenly lost all sense of celebration. The gathering had brought together Camilla, Prince William, Catherine, Princess Anne, senior relatives, and trusted palace figures for what was meant to be a controlled family evening. That mattered because private royal dinners often allow sensitive family issues to remain behind closed doors. Tonight, one piece of jewelry had broken that protection. Camilla saw the change in his face before anyone else understood it. She touched nothing, said nothing, but her expression tightened as the king kept staring at the brooch. A server approached with the next course. Charles lifted one hand. The movement was small, but absolute. Service stopped. The music ended. Then he looked directly at his wife and asked, "Where did you get that?" Camilla's composure hardened. She knew immediately that he had recognized it. William recognized it too. The prince leaned forward, eyes fixed on the same brooch, and the tension around him changed from confusion to something painfully personal. Diana, Princess of Wales, had been his mother, and the jewelry now sitting on Camilla's dress carried a meaning no palace inventory could reduce to metal and stones. Catherine noticed his reaction at once. She stayed close, watching him carefully as he struggled not to speak before Charles finished. The king made his decision quickly. He instructed non-family guests and unnecessary staff to leave the room, turning a formal banquet into a private family reckoning. Camilla remained beside her place. William remained seated. Anne watched Charles glance toward his eldest son before speaking again, and that single look told her the problem went far beyond wardrobe protocol. The brooch had reached Camilla without Charles's knowledge or approval, and he clearly believed its history demanded an explanation. And he wanted the truth immediately. But Charles's shock was only the beginning, because across the table William had already recognized something about Diana's brooch that made the question of how Camilla obtained it impossible to ignore. For most people in the room, the brooch was simply an elegant piece of royal jewelry. For Prince William, it was something entirely different. He remembered its connection to his mother, the circumstances under which she had worn it, and why seeing it unexpectedly on Camilla felt so deeply unsettling. Charles was confronting a breach of protocol. William was confronting a memory, and those two reactions were about to collide in the same room. William kept his voice low when he spoke. "Did you know whose brooch that was?" The prince did not raise his voice, but Catherine heard the anger beneath every word. She had heard him speak before about Diana's personal possessions as emotional family objects, not trophies of rank or wealth. Within this fictional account, the brooch had been preserved with a restricted collection, meaning personal items kept out of ordinary ceremonial use because of their private family significance. Camilla answered quickly. She insisted the piece had been cleared for the evening and rejected the idea that she had chosen it to provoke anyone. The queen consort looked toward Charles as if expecting him to confirm a misunderstanding, but the king did not rescue her. He stayed silent, studying her answer and William's reaction. That silence made the room heavier than any accusation. William pushed his chair back several inches. Catherine placed her hand against his wrist, stopping him before anger turned into confrontation. She told him that they needed to know how the brooch had left storage before deciding who was responsible. The future king looked at her, then forced himself to remain seated. His restraint mattered, because grief was pulling against his duty to stay controlled. Princess Anne broke the silence. She remembered the brooch being placed into restricted family storage after Diana's death, and her confirmation changed everything. Anne explained that she had seen the item listed among pieces not meant to circulate casually. Charles became quieter after hearing her recollection, because the problem was no longer only Camilla's choice. Someone inside the household had made the brooch available. The king asked one question: which member of the household had supplied it? Camilla named the wardrobe channel through which it had reached her, but she could not explain who approved the release. William looked ready to challenge her again, yet Catherine caught his eye and shook her head once. She remembered a disagreement over Diana's possessions, and she knew that argument might explain more than anyone wanted to admit. That restraint mattered, because the brooch had not appeared from nowhere, and one uncomfortable incident weeks earlier had already placed Diana's private legacy at the center of a growing palace dispute. Weeks before the banquet, there had been another room, another uncomfortable conversation, and the same unresolved question: who had the right to decide what happened to Diana's personal possessions? At the time, the disagreement had been contained behind palace doors. No announcement followed. No public confrontation erupted. Yet one decision made during that meeting created the exact conditions that would later bring Charles's banquet to a standstill, and Camilla had been sitting at the center of it. Charles had approved a private review of jewelry and keepsakes connected to deceased members of the royal family. The review was meant to separate crown property, items held for the monarchy rather than personally owned, from pieces treated as private family possessions. That distinction mattered, because ceremonial objects could be used for official purposes, while personal pieces carried different emotional and ownership concerns. William entered the process with one clear request: anything closely tied to Diana should remain outside ordinary wardrobe circulation. William did not frame his concern as a legal battle. He told Charles that some objects carried memories before they carried titles, and he believed their emotional importance to him and Prince Harry outweighed any value they might have as royal accessories. The future king pointed toward the closed jewelry case while making that argument, and the king listened without interrupting. Camilla listened too, but her reaction was very different. Camilla finally asked the question that changed everything. During that private Windsor jewelry review 3 weeks before the banquet, she wanted to know why Diana's rare brooch could not be worn at future royal occasions. William objected immediately. The prince said treating his mother's personal pieces like ordinary accessories crossed a boundary he had never agreed to surrender. Camilla heard something harsher in those words. To her, the objection sounded like a judgment on whether she would ever be allowed to occupy her role without Diana's memory standing beside her. The queen consort closed the jewelry folders sharply and ended the exchange. She left without acknowledging William again, while Charles remained behind with his son. The king then made his position clear in a documented household instruction. The brooch was to remain in storage until ownership and family wishes were fully settled. That decision should have ended the matter. Anne later found the detail that made the banquet incident far more disturbing. During her review of the household record, she discovered that access to the collection had been approved through an older authorization procedure that should no longer have been active. The princess immediately understood what that meant, and Charles understood it too when the information reached him. Either his direct instruction had been ignored, or someone inside the system believed they still possessed enough authority to bypass it. 3 weeks later, that unresolved argument had returned to Windsor in the most visible way possible, and Charles was finally ready to demand an answer from Camilla face to face. Once the banquet guests had been removed, Windsor's grand dining room suddenly felt painfully small. Only family remained, and Charles no longer had ceremony to hide behind. Camilla stood beside her chair with Diana's brooch still pinned to her dress. William remained several places away, visibly furious. Then Charles asked everyone except Camilla to give them a moment. What followed was not a public royal dispute. It was a husband asking his wife why she had crossed a boundary he believed was already settled. Charles dismissed the remaining household staff, then asked William, Catherine, and Anne to move into the adjoining room. Household staff are the trusted employees who manage the practical running of a royal residence, from formal service to private arrangements. The king wanted no audience for what came next. He waited until the door closed, then turned back toward Camilla. She immediately explained that a wardrobe aide had presented the brooch as available for the evening, and that nobody had told her it was formally restricted. Camilla expected that explanation to calm him. It did not. Charles reminded her that she had personally discussed the same brooch with William during the earlier jewelry review. The Queen Consort answered that she remembered the disagreement, but she believed his objection had been emotional rather than binding. She insisted she had never understood that the king had turned that family tension into an actual restriction. Charles placed both palms against the table. "You knew William had objected?" he asked. Camilla hesitated, and the pause carried more weight than any immediate denial could have. Finally she answered, "I knew he was unhappy." The king stared at her, because that admission changed the argument. She may not have known every detail of his instruction, but she knew the piece was sensitive before she chose to wear it. The monarch then told her what she had not known. After the earlier meeting, he had issued a direct private instruction that Diana's identified personal pieces were not to be released until the family review was complete. The family review was simply the internal process being used to decide which possessions were private keepsakes and which could still be used officially. Camilla's expression changed. She understood now that the brooch should never have reached her wardrobe at all. Camilla gave Charles the name of the aide who had supplied it. She also repeated exactly what the aide had told her. The piece had been approved from above. The king did not answer immediately. Instead, he called Anne back into the room because she had helped oversee the review. The princess listened to the explanation, then contradicted it without hesitation. She had approved nothing. That admission changed the argument completely, but Anne's return to the room was about to transform a painful family dispute into a question of royal authority. Princess Anne entered the room without drama, but what she said carried more force than shouting ever could. The question was no longer simply whether Camilla should have worn Diana's brooch. It was whether anyone inside the royal household had the power to release it after Charles had specifically said no. Anne knew how the review had been structured. She knew who had access. And when Charles asked whether she had approved the brooch, her answer came immediately. Anne looked directly at Charles and said, "I did not release it." The princess then explained the temporary family rule that had been agreed during the review. No disputed personal jewelry was supposed to leave protected storage without direct approval from the king or agreement from the relatives assigned to represent family interests. Protected storage simply meant a controlled collection where sensitive personal items were kept until questions of ownership and use were settled. The rule existed to prevent exactly this kind of emotional collision. Camilla reached toward the brooch for the first time, suddenly uncomfortable wearing it. The Queen Consort had been told the piece was cleared, but Anne's answer stripped away the certainty behind that claim. Charles slowly sat down and asked whether any alternative approval route still existed. The king was no longer speaking like an angry husband. He was trying to understand how an instruction carrying his authority had been bypassed without anyone noticing. William re-entered after hearing the voices rise. The prince looked first at Camilla, then at Anne, trying to separate two painful questions. One concerned his mother and the shock of seeing her jewelry worn unexpectedly. The other concerned responsibility. Had Camilla deliberately forced the issue, or had a broken palace system placed the brooch in her hands? Anne noticed the struggle in his expression and softened her tone when she addressed him again. The answer came through a documented household access check. Anne reviewed the entry with Charles and confirmed that the brooch had been withdrawn using an outdated inventory code linked to the Queen Consort's wardrobe office. An inventory code was simply an internal permission used to track who could request stored items. The troubling detail was clear. The old access route had remained active even after the king's newer restriction should have replaced it. Camilla denied ordering anyone to bypass the rule. Charles accepted that distinction mattered, but he refused to treat it as a complete defense. The monarch reminded her that she already knew William had objected to this exact piece. Even if the system failed, she should have questioned why the brooch had suddenly become available. The mystery of the authorization had narrowed, but the emotional damage was already spreading, and the first consequence would fall directly on Camilla before the night was over. Camilla had entered the banquet wearing the brooch as part of a formal royal appearance. Less than an hour later, she was standing in a private Windsor room, removing it under the eyes of the king and his family. The gesture was small, but everyone understood its meaning. She was not merely taking off jewelry. She was acknowledging that the evening could not continue while Diana's memory sat physically between her, Charles, and William. Charles made the decision before anyone could suggest resuming dinner. The banquet was over. The king instructed the household to tell the remaining guests that the gathering had ended because of a private family matter, a phrase used to protect sensitive issues from immediate public explanation. Camilla understood what that meant. The evening would now be remembered not for celebration, but for the moment everything stopped because of the brooch she had chosen to wear. Camilla reached up and unfastened it herself. The Queen Consort said nothing as she placed the piece carefully into Anne's open hand. Anne closed her fingers around it without triumph, knowing temporary custody simply meant she would safeguard the brooch until the internal review established exactly how it had been released. The princess did not treat the moment as a victory. She could see the humiliation on Camilla's face, and she understood that the family had already paid an emotional price. William did not celebrate either. The prince watched the brooch leave Camilla's hands and felt no sense of victory. Instead, the sight dragged him back toward the reason he had reacted so strongly in the first place. This was about Diana. His anger had never truly been about defeating the Queen Consort. It came from the fear that his mother's personal history could be absorbed into royal routine until its meaning disappeared. Charles responded with a harder safeguard. The monarch ordered every item clearly associated with Diana removed from normal wardrobe access systems until individual family decisions were recorded. A wardrobe access system was simply the internal process used to request jewelry for official appearances. He wanted no second mistake. Shortly afterward, a documented account from the aide who prepared Camilla's jewelry confirmed that an outdated authorization had been mistaken for current approval. Negligence had opened the door, not a secret command from Charles or Anne. William turned to his father before leaving. He asked for a private conversation the following morning, and the prince made clear that he was not seeking punishment for Camilla. He wanted something more permanent, a decision about what should happen to Diana's personal possessions from this point forward. The banquet had ended, the brooch had been removed, and the immediate crisis seemed contained. But William's request for a private meeting would change the emotional direction of the entire affair. The next morning brought none of the grandeur of the previous night. There was no banquet table, no audience, and no Camilla. Charles and William met alone, with no aides present, to discuss something both men had spent years approaching from different directions: Diana's place in their family memory. What began as a conversation about one brooch quickly became something deeper. William did not ask his father to punish anyone. He asked him to draw a boundary that would finally last. William spoke first, carefully but without retreating. The prince explained that he was not fighting for possession of every object associated with Diana, nor was he trying to turn grief into control. He wanted a clear difference between deeply personal items and institutional royal jewelry, meaning pieces held or used as part of the monarchy's official collection. That distinction mattered because one category represented public duty, while the other could carry memories belonging to children, spouses, and relatives long after ceremonies ended. Charles listened without interrupting. The king admitted that the monarchy had often treated possessions through inventories, records, and administrative categories because that system made large collections manageable. But he also acknowledged the weakness in that approach. A catalog could record who stored a brooch, yet it could never record what William remembered when he saw his mother wearing it. The monarch finally understood why the mistake at the banquet had cut far deeper than a simple breach of procedure. William then said what he had avoided saying the previous night. Watching Camilla wear the brooch had made him feel as though part of Diana's memory had been moved into someone else's story without his permission. The prince did not accuse the queen consort of deliberately trying to erase his mother. His pain was more complicated than that. He feared that familiarity could slowly strip sentimental objects of the meaning they once carried. Charles did not defend what happened. He removed his glasses, placed them on the table, and looked directly at his son. "Then we should have settled this long ago," he said. The king admitted that clearer protections should have existed years earlier, before one mistake forced everyone to confront the issue in the middle of a family gathering. The monarch then made the decision William had been seeking. Diana's personally identified jewelry would be permanently separated from ordinary queen consort wardrobe circulation. Charles also proposed that the family interests of William and Harry be formally considered whenever their mother's personal possessions were preserved, transferred, or approved for future use. The prince accepted the idea because it protected memory without turning it into revenge. Charles had one final condition. Before any household decision was announced, he wanted to speak privately with Camilla. The king refused to build peace with his sons by humiliating his wife, and William agreed that the boundary should be firm without becoming punishment. That sentence ended the battle between father and son, but Charles still had one more conversation to face, the one that would determine whether Camilla accepted the boundary or resisted it. By morning, the cancelled Windsor banquet had become impossible to contain. Yet the image that captured public attention was not a photograph of jewelry or a palace statement. It was the sight of visitors gathering outside Windsor Castle, as broadcasters described an extraordinary family disagreement involving Diana's legacy. Inside the walls, Charles and Camilla were still speaking privately. Outside them, an intensely personal dispute had already become a national conversation about memory, respect, and royal boundaries. Charles authorized a short palace communication that confirmed only two things: the banquet had ended early, and procedures involving private family jewelry were being reviewed. Palace communications are official messages used to explain royal matters without exposing every private detail behind them. The king refused to turn the statement into an accusation against Camilla. That restraint mattered, because one careless sentence could transform a household error into a public judgment on her entire place within the family. Camilla watched the coverage grow more severe by the hour. The queen consort understood that the explanation about outdated access codes would never carry the same emotional force as the simple image of her wearing something connected to Diana. Some commentators focused on her judgment. Others argued that the deeper problem was a confusing palace system that had failed to protect historically sensitive possessions. She listened until one broadcast reduced the entire night to a single question about whether she had crossed a line she should have recognized. The public reaction became impossible to ignore. Outside Windsor Castle, people gathered behind the barriers while a television correspondent held up that morning's front page, dominated by a photograph of the castle and a headline about the banquet's sudden cancellation. Several people nearby carried flowers associated with Diana. turning one quiet gathering into a powerful symbol of how strongly her memory still lived beyond palace walls. Charles saw the same report, and the king knew the argument was no longer private. Camilla switched off the television halfway through another discussion. She sat in silence for several seconds before looking at Charles. "Keep it with her things," she said. The queen consort acknowledged that she should have questioned the brooch the moment it appeared, after her earlier disagreement with William. The king told her he would not allow anyone to portray her as having stolen it, but he also made clear that Diana's personal pieces would remain protected. Charles finally saw a path toward closure. William was no longer demanding answers, and Camilla had accepted the boundary. The king arranged one final family meeting, determined to end the dispute before humiliation hardened into resentment. For the first time since Charles stopped the banquet, everyone involved now agreed on what should happen to the brooch. But the king still needed to decide what the night would ultimately mean for his family. The final meeting at Windsor did not end with accusations. It ended with a small jewelry case sitting closed between four people who had spent the previous 24 hours confronting grief, loyalty, pride, and history. Charles, Camilla, William, and Anne no longer disagreed about what should happen. The brooch would not return to Camilla's wardrobe. It would remain connected to Diana's personal legacy. But the greater decision concerned how the family would carry that memory forward. Charles spoke first and made the decision final. The rare brooch would remain among the protected personal pieces associated with Diana, rather than returning to routine royal use. Protected personal pieces meant family possessions kept apart from ceremonial jewelry because of their private emotional importance. The king also ordered the access rules rewritten so outdated wardrobe permissions could never release sentimental items again. He wanted the mistake corrected at its source, not merely hidden after the embarrassment had passed. Camilla then turned directly to William. The queen consort told him she had never intended to claim something that belonged emotionally to his mother, and she admitted she should have understood why seeing the brooch on her would hurt him. William listened without interrupting. The prince accepted her explanation, but he did not pretend the previous night had been easy. His response was quiet, because closure for him did not require a dramatic show of forgiveness. It required knowing the same boundary would not be crossed again. Charles accepted his own share of responsibility. The king admitted that he had allowed questions around Diana's possessions to remain unclear for too long, leaving emotion and procedure to collide when they should have been settled years earlier. His decision to halt the banquet was therefore not ultimately a punishment aimed at Camilla. It became an acknowledgement that the family needed rules strong enough to protect memory, without turning grief into a permanent source of conflict. Anne picked up the brooch one final time and returned it to its designated case. The princess closed the lid and moved it toward William. He rested one hand on the case for a moment, then pushed it gently back toward the center of the table. That gesture said more than possession ever could. The future king did not need to own every part of Diana's past. He needed to know that her memory would be treated with care. Charles chose no punishment, no purge, and no public humiliation. Camilla accepted the boundary, William accepted the explanation, and Anne accepted responsibility for ensuring the new protections were followed. The family finally separated remembrance from rivalry. Charles stopped a banquet because of a brooch, but by the time the doors at Windsor closed again, the family had settled something far larger. Diana's place in their history would be protected without turning her memory into another weapon, and Camilla's future would move forward without requiring Diana's past to be worn, borrowed, or erased. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.